last time, we had talked about the rise of the Roman Republic and then expanding of the empire. And we're going to see that now the Republic has fallen and is going to be replaced really by this period of monarchical rule, where we're going to have a series of emperors, and this sort of downward spiral is going to at least have its seeds in this beginning of the rule by the Caesars, right? And so the first one we're going to be talking about is Caesar Augustus, right? And Augustus is going to be the first of the real hereditary monarchs of the Roman state. But he's not going to be this sort of power-hungry dictator that later emperors are going to enjoy, because he's coming out of this period of the Republic, and of course a lot of the Romans are still very used to the idea, well, we have a republic. And so what he's going to do is he's going to create a sort of Republican-looking government on the outward side in order to keep the aristocrats, the senators, and various other groups happy. But ever increasingly, we're going to see that he's going to concentrate the actual power in the state in himself, what he referred to as the princeps, right? The princeps, or the first citizen, which of course was Caesar Augustus himself. Eventually what we'll see is by the end of his reign, he had developed a system where he could make his own laws, he could veto any that he didn't like. Now the elections of the assemblies especially still took place, but what you're going to see is ever increasingly through social and political pressure, Augustus's men almost always won. And so what that means now is the assemblies really begin to decline in importance. If you know who's going to win, then actual elections and decision-making levels of power in the state, they don't matter as much. And so they're going to begin to go away, and you'll see that, again, rule of the street and rule through the military is what's going to begin to take its place. So what you're going to see is, despite the fact that he's got a growing amount of autocracy, which you would normally think that the Republican-leaning Roman citizens would chafe against, he was actually pretty popular. Augustus was a pretty popular guy because he brought peace and some sanity back to a government that had descended into a series of civil wars. And so here we can see some scenes, right? This is an artist's rendition of people supplicating themselves in front of Caesar Augustus. And then this is Brian Blessed, his portrayal of Caesar Augustus in a BBC movie from I think it's the 70s or the 80s. So all right, what about Augustus and what did he do, right? Augustus' number one position that ensured that he was going to have the final authority in the state was that he was the army's commander, right? He maintained a somewhat small, by the size of the Roman Empire's standards, but highly professionalized army. The army itself is a really important factor in understanding why Rome is able to do what it is able to do for such a long period of time. The Romans, they're not generally regarded as sort of great artists, great thinkers. I mean, they have people that are going to be great in these categories, but the Romans are really organized, and they're really efficient at what they do. And of course, when necessary, they throw a bunch of resources at a problem, and you can find all of this evidenced through the construction, the maintenance, and the application of their armed forces. And so what you would have is you'd start with a legion, which the Romans put together, and everything that you needed, infantry, cavalry, specialized equipment, could be found in a legion. And you broke that down into a cohort, you broke the cohorts down into centuries, and so Roman armies were not only efficient, but they were also very flexible in terms of how they could be used. These are sometimes referred to as the maniples, and we get our term manipulate from their ability to move on the battlefield and fight in different formations. And the Romans were really great because they kept the fighting simple. They kept it organized. And so this was something that you could train somebody to do. They could get really, really good at it, and then they get to a point where they're super efficient at doing it. So not only do you have a military component, but you're going to see that the Roman armies maintain not only security, but prosperity. Places where the Roman army was, people feel secure, they feel safe. They feel safe to engage in trade and economic activity. Trade and economic activity is going to be more money and more resources for Rome. Now, Augustus is going to add more territory using both conquest and diplomacy, so the Roman Empire is going to grow some more. His major goal, though, was to try to extend to some natural borders, all the way to the Rhine River, and then to a few other places like the Danube. But his major goal was to eliminate a lot of the barbarian tribes in what you and I would refer to now as Germany. However, 3 of his legions are going to be wiped out in one of the rare defeats during this period at the Teutoburg Wall, or the Teutoburg Forest, in the year AD 9. And here you can see an artist's representation of what that was. These guys ambush the Romans when they're kind of strung out and they can't form their normal formations. And so this is part of the reason why they're able to ambush and destroy these 3 legions, is they don't let them do their normal business of getting together and kind of fighting as a team. And here you'll see the growth here of the Roman Empire. The orange is what Augustus is going to inherit, and then the green is what he's going to add to his territory as well. So when you look into then the organization of the Roman army, you can see that the chart really lays this all out. How at various points in history these guys would organize themselves, and everything really had a great way to put things together. You can see the cohorts in the march. They can just simply change their facing and apply sort of different directions for fighting. You've always got a front line, you've always got a flank, you've always got a reserve, and so this is part of the reason why they were so successful. When you zoom in, you see how these guys, they fight together, they form lines front and back and across their center. Here's what a Roman centurion commander would have looked like. This would have been a little bit of a later presentation because he's got a metal chest piece rather than a leather one. But again, you can see this is what these legionnaire guys would have looked like. The pelium that he's going to use to try to disarm or de-shield an enemy who's going to have this thing. It's going to be stuck in his shield, and he's going to remove this. And then, of course, you have relatively efficient. You get the Roman, the rounded shield that they have, the gladius, the short stabbing weapon. These guys are going to come at you, and they're going to try to get up under your armor, and they're going to try to put you off balance. So all this is very, very effective. You can see these guys now in their marching order. Everything goes up and over on your shoulders. You got your pilium, you got your gladius, you got your helmet, which can also serve as a bucket. And you've got your marching hat, everything in your bindle on your back with your shield. And of course, these Roman guys were very efficient, not only at fighting, but also at marching. They were sometimes asked to do 18 to 20 Roman miles a day and then go into combat. So they were pretty tough guys, right? Augustus was also interested in trying to streamline the efficiency of the multi-tiered layer of the Roman government, which had kind of gotten a little bit bloated. He wants to reduce the Senate's control of the outlying provinces. And what he's going to do, though, to smooth over any ruffled feathers is he's going to input different levels of administration at various different times. And he's going to put in these provincial governors himself. He's going to make sure he pays their salaries. But over the course of time, you're going to see that the people that local provincials are going to go to are no longer the Senate's guys, but are going to be Caesar's guys. And, of course, they are loyal to Caesar directly because he's the one that's paying their salaries. So this is one way to kind of elbow out the Senate from control of the outlying provinces. He's going to use the same sort of patron-client system that people on the streets of Rome would use for wealthy, non-wealthy patrons, except he's going to up it to a massive state level where Rome itself is the patron, and then many of these provinces are the client state. In terms of locals cooperating with what Rome wants to do, the locals then get Roman resources and protection in return for cooperation and resources. And so this is how, in many cases, this worked itself out. Now, Augustus made sure to continue this process of Romanization, which was really important. How do you take over a people and make sure that they stay loyal to you? You turn them into you. This was one of the things that the Romans were exceptionally good at, and really explains a lot of why these guys are able to put together an army, an empire the way that they do, right? They would send colonists out to these places that then become local leaders because they have connections back to Rome. Many of these people were, of course, ex-army soldiers who had picked up Latin, business contacts, political contacts with people in Rome itself, and of course, they were offered, in many cases, land as a bounty for serving in the Roman army. And of course, then they're going to help bring many of these provincial areas into the Roman culturation, right? One of the problems that we're going to see extant here is the growing diffusion here between the three major levels of Roman society. You have the senatorial class, which are these people born into wealth and power, the equestrian class, which are these people that have gained a great deal of wealth over a relatively short period of time, but aren't necessarily born in the senatorial class. And this, of course, these equestrians gain this wealth in large part due to the massive economic expansion of the Roman Empire. And then you get the lower classes, the plebeians, right? These people who are kind of shut out of all this, right? Ever increasing to the lower class, the plebeian class had their voice heard through the assemblies and through these various other elected bodies. And all of a sudden they're finding that their voice really isn't as much of an importance as well. And you have some big changes in terms of who owns land. Small to middle-sized landowners are kind of going away. A lot of these equestrian and senatorial guys are buying up the land into larger latifundia plots. And so many of these people are trying to go into town, into the cities to find work. It's not always available. And so you've got a real social problem now with some of these people who aren't able to find work. And of course, without land, they can't vote. Augustus is going to begin this policy of providing the dole, which is free food, just to keep these people kind of going, and often distractions in terms of public games, right? These guys also are going to have army opportunities. And to keep the equestrians happy, in many cases what they would do is, in exchange for loyalty and or resources or loans or things like that, is the equestrians could sometimes be made senators as a reward for patriotic service. So this was a good way to keep all the equestrians happy. Hey, if you stay loyal to the government, maybe you'll be made a senator, right? Augustus is also interested in reinvigorating religion. He felt that a lot of the state religion of paganism had kind of started to slide. He felt this was an ethical and moral center for the Roman people to have. So he's going to begin this campaign of building and repairing temples, especially in the city of Rome itself. Part and parcel with this, after Augustus dies, the Senate is going to hold a vote, and they're going to declare that Augustus was in fact a god. He was a god on earth, and he was worshipped as part of the Roman pantheon, and this was required state participation, that if you want to be a good patriotic Roman, you've got to worship the official Roman gods, including which, of course, is our poor dead emperor, Augustus. We will see that future emperors, they're not going to wait quite so long to have themselves deified. Right? Now, we don't have time to go through necessarily all of the Roman emperors, but we are going to hit some of the highlights because they do help us bracket some of the major periods here of Roman history. Right? And a good example of this is the first ruling dynasty. They're the Julians. All of these guys are related to Julius Caesar, hence the name, although some of them a little bit tangentially related. Right? They're the first 5 emperors of the Roman Empire, and at least according to some accounts, all of them are killed. Right? Also, all of them help increase the power of the emperorship, right? Now, when Augustus dies, he's going to leave his office to Tiberius. I know that those of you who are wondering what the T in James T. Kirk was, it's for Tiberius, and those of you who know, because you're a Star Trek weirdo, like me, then you know it stands for Tiberius, but you may not know who that is. He's the second emperor of the Roman Empire. I have no idea why they picked that, because Tiberius was a pretty non-noteworthy guy. He was actually okay for a while, but being the emperor, it kind of sucks. I mean, you got to go to meetings, and you got to make decisions, and then people complain. He exiled himself to an island for a while until eventually some people were like, "Hey, are you going to be the emperor?" Nah, let the Senate do it, whatever. And so he's going to get himself assassinated while he's away from the office. He is replaced by this guy Caligula. Right? Caligula is a total wacko. Now, some sources downplay his total insanity. Some of them will play against it, but the dude was really, really good at having some pretty erratic behavior. According to some sources, he made his horse a senator. He may have had, sort of wild sexual contests. Maybe those are exaggerations. Some of them are probably fabrications. But eventually, he reaches the point where his capriciousness and erratic nature causes his bodyguard to have him killed. Right? Claudius is Caligula's, I think he's his uncle. And Claudius is in the palace when there's this sort of sweep through by the assassins who are getting rid of not only Caligula, but basically everybody that's related to him. And the Praetorian Guard, whose job it is to protect the emperor, good job, guys, right? They come in here and they find him hiding behind a curtain. Well, Caligula was largely overlooked by most political people in Rome anyway, even before the massive purge with Caligula's assassination, because he was partially paralyzed. He apparently had some other birth defects. He stuttered when he talked, right? And so nobody thought that this guy was a serious contender for anything. But the Praetorian Guard said, we need an emperor because our job is to defend the emperor, so guess what? You're it, right? Claudius was actually a pretty bright guy. He had written on a number of topics. He was a pretty brainy fellow, but he also understood that if he wants to maintain his position and not get assassinated, he's got to build up political support. The surefire way to build up political support in Rome is to go on a conquering spree, right? He's going to help expand the empire, especially into Britain, and he's going to make the bureaucracy much more efficient. He's actually pretty interested in making sure that he does his job, right? His successor is going to be Nero, and Nero actually, when he starts off, he's a fairly young guy when he gets to be the emperor, and he works with the Senate, but after a while he gets kind of tired of being the emperor, and he would go around a tour of Italy being a public performer. He's a singer and an actor. Basically, he's killed for being a weirdo. The Romans didn't particularly think this was great, that the divine leader of the Roman people is a common theater person, and so some generals get a hold of him, and they manage to cut his head off. Right? So here's Caligula, looking crazy. Right? This is Nero. Rome burned while Nero was emperor. And the stories at the time were that Nero set fire, or Nero was pretty happy that this part of Rome burned down because it enabled him to build a palace. Anyway, a lot of fingers get pointed at Nero for this disaster that happens to Rome while he's the emperor. And of course, Nero does what a lot of politicians do when they get in trouble, which is deflect the blame. In this case, Nero deflected the blame towards the Christians. The Christians burned Rome down. First persecution of Christians happens under Nero, where a bunch of them are put to death. And Nero also then gets to build his palace where he wanted it to, right? The next ruling dynasty are these, the Flavians, right? The Flavians, right? And with Nero's death, it turns out that not everybody was just totally on board with assassinating the emperor and replacing him with the person that really wanted to do it. And we're going to have a civil war that erupts as a result of this, right? And Vespasian, as we would say in English, who's an army general, he's elected emperor by the men of his army. Wow, that's pretty convenient. See, these guys understand that, hey, if our guy gets to be the emperor, then we'll get all the goodies for telling him so, right? Well, if you're the emperor, you should go to Rome and take over, which is exactly what Vespasian decides to do. He marches his army to Rome, drives out Nero's killers, and sets himself up as the new ruling emperor. Not only does he create a situation where he can take over, but really all of he and his family now can start their own new imperial line. You'll see the beginning of the use of the term imperator, or as you and I might say in English, emperor, instead of this whole, well, I'm the first citizen, right, in describing their office. We will then go through this period, right, after the last Flavian emperor, Domitian, gets himself assassinated. And instead, this guy Nerva is going to be the emperor. And this period is often referred to by historians as the Pax Romana, right? The Roman peace. Sometimes also referred to as the 5 good emperors. And I've got good in quotes because if you like administration, if you like efficiency, if you like things to be relatively calm, these guys are good emperors. If you're a Christian and you like not getting killed, these guys aren't very good, right? Ever increasingly, starting with Nerva, you're going to have these guys that focus really a lot on administration. They're also going to be the ones that expand the empire to kind of their greatest extent, and they're going to focus a lot of time on an expensive building program of both civil structures, like the Pantheon, and then also military structures, which help undergird the infrastructure of society, like Hadrian's Wall in Britain at this time as well. So here you can see the Pantheon, this giant dome where all the gods of the Roman Empire reside. It's designed to make you sort of feel small and insignificant, which the Romans were actually pretty good at doing. And then one of these other massive building constructions, Hadrian's Wall that goes across one of the narrow little necks on the island of Britain. You've got Scotland to the north, you've got Britannia to the south. A lot of Hadrian's Wall is still there. So the Romans, they're pretty effective at building this stuff. And of course, many of these places that were major Roman forts on this are still important towns as well. How big would the empire have gotten if they had been allowed to expand? We don't know, but these guys are the ones that bring it to its greatest extent, right? By 117 AD, the armies of Rome had really pushed the Roman border in a lot of ways too far. They had too much border to defend. They kind of had over-conquered. Ever increasingly, the social situation of who it was to be in the army had radically changed from the period of a few centuries before during the Roman Republic. Military service was no longer seen as, well, this is what you've got to do in the army, go and defend Rome. It becomes now an extension of the political willpower of the Roman elite, right? Military service becomes a burden for average Roman citizens. So what this means is if the Romans want to try to defend this huge border, they've got to try to bring in somebody else. They allow for the influx of provincial barbarians, right? And this is actually a Greek term, which means anybody that's not us, right? These guys thought that anybody that didn't speak their language sounded like chickens clucking, right? So bark bark. That's where it comes from. And they're going to serve in the army, sometimes in national units, rather than being fully integrated into Roman units. So this is a kind of a dangerous change. Now, many of these external nationals, these non-Romans, especially the Germans, view the Romans as a very admirable people. They look at what the Romans have, roads and order and law and shiny armor and money and textiles and all this kind of stuff. But the problem is you want to be the Romans. And if you want to be the Romans, you've got to stop the Romans from being the Romans. So there's going to be kind of a love-hate relationship that in many cases are going to exist between especially these Germanic barbarians and the Romans themselves. We like the Romans. We want to be with the Romans. We really want to kind of knock the Romans out of the way, right? Many of these Romanizing colonies, though, are going to continue throughout this period to help strengthen the people at the edges of the empire. So we haven't seen a total breakdown yet as well. Here you can see some examples. There's a Roman bridge and aqueduct system that's still in use today as a result of this. The end of this period, right, is going to see, as we get into the 3rd century, things take a marked sharp turn down for the Romans. Emperor Commodus gets himself assassinated. Basically, he's a pretty cruel guy. And that's going to create a situation where civil wars are going to erupt. A guy named Severus, right? Severus is going to seize power with his army, right? And what we're going to happen is from the Severans, and really on down for a while, military monarchies become the rule. Ever increasingly, the focus here of the emperor from a top-down perspective is to make sure that you've got the army, and that the army is working for you, and then nobody else can seize power from you. So you make sure that the army gets whatever they want. They want money, they want land, we need to bribe them, we need to give them power, whatever's going to happen. If this doesn't sound like a good recipe for a stable social situation, that's because it's not, right? And we're going to see that whoever gets to be at the top of this structure gets the lion's share of the resources and the glory and the fame and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a strong impetus now to be the person who knocks off the person ahead of you, right? So for example, ever increasingly the people and what they kind of want and how you have social formation gets shoved to the back. Throughout the 3rd century, there are going to be 22 emperors or thereabouts. A couple of documents disagree on this, but there are going to be 22 emperors. 20 of them find themselves assassinated. That's not a very good rate, right? Civil wars are going to ensue after many of these assassinations. Most of the Severans of their dynasty are going to meet a pretty grisly, meaning assassinated, end, right? Barbarians are going to use this chaos of Romans fighting other Romans as an opportunity to invade the empire in very large numbers. Now the Romans managed to get their act together and push the barbarians out this one time, but they were really pretty terribly weakened. This is Pupienus, right? Who is one of these Roman emperors. I think he was like a middle emperor in the year of the 3 emperors, but he's one of these guys that kind of takes over very briefly and manages to get himself assassinated. And I love this little animated file because it gives you an idea of what, why the Romans are so unstable as a result of that. You stab the guy ahead of you, and then shortly thereafter you get stabbed in the back and get replaced. So if this doesn't seem like the best way to run a railroad, or in this case a Roman Empire, you're right again on this one. So the invasions here in the 3rd century do a great deal of damage to the economy. A lot of crops are destroyed, a lot of villagers are killed. It's going to destabilize the economy here and there, right? So what that means, though, is the empire, as it redresses its situation militarily, is you have an ever-decreasing number of people providing resources and support and the human material necessary to have an empire, right, that are still having to hold up the same amount of weight. So in terms of government, in terms of taxes, in terms of army duties, right? All this is going to fall to a smaller and smaller number of people. So this per person means that it's going to get harder and harder. And of course, as military pressure increases, that means you need more military forces. But money and people are in really short supply, so that means barbarian mercenaries are hired, and generally speaking, they're given land inside the empire as a trade. And so this is what you'd see. You'd see some really non-Roman looking people. In this case, it looks like they're plucking pigeons. I don't know. But they were expected to fight off these invaders that are coming in against the Romans, right? In 305 AD, we're going to have this Emperor Diocletian. He's going to come into this and he's going to restore some sanity to this situation where you don't have civil war after civil war. But he's also going to divide the empire into eastern and western prefectures to try to provide more efficient component parts. But in reality, what this is going to do is create a duplication of systems. You're going to have an eastern government and a western government, and then eventually we will see that this split is going to become permanent to where you're just going to have an eastern empire and a western empire. We're also going to have a guy who comes into this after Diocletian named Constantine, right? And Constantine is going to have to win a couple of civil wars to make sure that he's got supreme control of the empire. By this point, the emperors are virtual kings. The Senate is almost completely irrelevant. One of the jokes going around was that it was no longer the Senate of the Roman Empire. The Senate was just the town council of Rome. Constantine actually concentrates much more of his energy on the eastern half of his empire because he looks at the map, he looks at what's going on socioeconomically, and realizes that the West is in a lot of trouble, there's a lot of hassle, and so he moves his capital to Byzantium, renames it Constantinople after himself, and basically concentrates his efforts on maintaining the eastern or Greek half of the Roman Empire. So the West is kind of left to its own devices, right? So the empire is pretty stable at this point at least, but is pretty straining. Ever increasingly, you'll see that imperial edicts coming out were forcing people now to keep on working in whatever job they wanted to. So you have a great deal of inefficiency and coercion that have crept into this. Economic distress forced a lot of people into landed slavery or bonded slavery in the cities. Jobs were often seen as a burden rather than an economic opportunity, right? taxes are high, profits are low. This is not a good social situation to have. But for things in Constantinople, it's looking up pretty good, right? This is the Hagia Sophia that eventually will be built in Constantine's city. And so Constantinople becomes, in a lot of ways, the new Rome. Constantine needs to get a lot of credit, though, in terms of his major contributions to Roman culture, and then, of course, later culture that is going to pick up on the Romans. Many of the huge contributions are going to come from his codification at his behest of Roman law. The old Roman law had been on these 12 tables, the 12 tables of Roman law. But like everything, law, customs, social institutions, they have to be updated with changing times. He wants to have his legal scholars leave less Roman law up to interpretation. This is another important legal principle that we in America like to hew to, that similar circumstances should lead to similar results in terms of the law. We're also going to see that Constantine is going to convert to Christianity. He's going to, in 305, make it to where people can be a Christian if they want to, so much so that Christianity works its way in the 4th century into Roman society, that by 395, under Theodosius, Christianity is actually the official religion of the Roman Empire. So we need to back up a little bit and understand what is Christianity. Where does this come from? Why all of a sudden do we have this? We talked about it with Nero. We talked about it with now Constantine and Theodosius. Okay, if you look at the Roman world, right, the Roman imperial world into which Christianity comes into, right, you had a lot of different faiths. You had old pagan-style religions, you had newer pagan-style religions, you had the mystery cults, you had official state gods of various governments, and so you had a world of faith that was, generally speaking, pretty diverse, pretty dispersed, weak, and for a lot of people was very dissatisfying, and you could tell that because of the number of people that kind of went from place to place, right? Into the scene comes a Jewish carpenter, Yeshu, right, but in English today, Jesus, right? And he begins to preaching this new faith based on a personal relationship with God through Jesus himself, right? Jesus is the key to God. The Jews get pretty upset when Jesus, while he's being interrogated, claims to be God incarnate. He's the Son of God, right? And they want to get rid of this guy. Well, the problem is, of course, Roman law says that only Romans can order a death sentence. So the Jews demanded that the Romans execute Jesus for blasphemy. The Romans, who had a lot of trouble with the Jews in their Judean province, said, okay, fine, whatever, right? We'll do it. We'll have Jesus crucified, which is a typical punishment. A lot of people were crucified during this. And so Jesus isn't really all that special in this regard, right? Well, if you only got 2 bullet points, this really wouldn't make a slide. We wouldn't be talking about this, right? The problem with this is Jesus' followers, a lot of them apparently, claimed that they had seen Jesus after he had come back from the dead. Well, that's kind of a big deal, right? Dead people tend to not walk around a whole lot, right? They saw him. Not only was he still alive, but he looked fantastic, right? And that he continued to have theological statements about what was going to happen. They reported that he had been seen ascending into heaven, but that part of the theological teaching was that he would return on a day of judgment for humanity to reconcile God and man. So this is the theological side of Christianity when we attach it to historical events. You get the crucifixion, you get the resurrection. These are the great moments to understand Christianity. So, well, all right, there were a lot of different faiths. A lot of different gods, goddesses, mystery cults, all kinds of stuff that was going on. There were Jews that were active here in the Roman Empire. So what's the deal with this? We're going to see that the new faith spreads out actually relatively quickly in the Roman world, right? Part of the reason that it has a great deal of appeal was that it held out something for all of humanity. Rich, poor, women, men, kids, different races, different nationalities, etc., right? What was interesting was, even when, starting with especially Nero and then definitely Diocletian, persecutions began against them because they refused to worship the pagan Roman emperor, especially the emperor worship, and they began to get persecuted for this. People continued in this faith, although some of them hid, and some of them did recant and then recanted their recantation. Is that right? So anyway, Constantine, though, is going to become Rome's first Christian emperor. According to him, he has a Christian vision right before this battle that gives him a Christian symbol, the Chi Rho symbol. He says, under this banner you will conquer. He wins the Battle of Malvern Bridge, right? And he then says, okay, I'm a Christian. If you guys want to be a Christian in the Roman Empire, you can. Prior to that, it had been, for the most part, illegal, right? Fast forward 90 years, and not only is Christianity allowed, Christianity is required. It's the official religion of the Roman state. So it goes to show what the difference 90 years can make. So here you can see, this is an artist's rendition of the Battle of Malvern Bridge, and then there's the Cairo symbol that Constantine said came to him in a vision. When you talk about Christianity and how it gets started, interestingly enough, what's going to happen is you have relatively small neighborhood meetings of these people that would get together, and for the most part, you would have them in Christian homes. Sometimes they had to hide in places like the catacombs, which is about as much fun as having church in a graveyard, which is pretty much the same thing, right? And once Christianity could come out into the open, you would see eventually larger church-based worship. They would use an organizational process where the cities would be the bases of these Christianity, and you'd have a church hierarchy that would develop as well. You had priests in the local churches that were doing their work, but they would be then overseen by bishops in charge of the cities of parishes to make sure that the theology was consistent with Christian teachings, and then also you had a number of other administrative functions because Christianity would gather resources for charitable work, and they had to also communicate with each other to make sure that they were all on the same page. Well, if this sounds a lot like Roman organization, that's because a lot of these people were Romans, right? And this model of organization becomes really, really entrenched, and over the course of time, the laity began to have actually relatively little influence over their leaders, and it became instead the leaders picking other leaders going forward. Christian leaders, not only do they develop a great deal of influence in terms of leadership over the people in the pews, but also we're going to see that they get incorporated very heavily into the Roman government, because especially as we talk about the declining period of the Roman Empire, the Christian churches organization was one of the few organizations that was actually really functioning very well. Here you can see the floor plan and then a little picture of one of these early Christian house/churches where you would have one of the rooms of the house converted over here into a worship service where these people would get together and they would sing songs. And they would listen to a guy talk about theology or how to apply Christianity to your daily lives. They would read some from the epistles or from gospels or whatever, and then they would have a meal. It sounds a whole lot like Christian church services that you go to now. Well, there you go, right? And this is what one would look like by the time you get to the open churches of the 4th century. So by the time you get to the 300s and you could just come out and say, hey, there's a bunch of us that are Christians, let's all go to church together in a building. This is what one would look like. And for those of you who say, that's what a church looks like now. Architectural style has become traditional. Then it really gets amped up on steroids. This is what St. Peter's Basilica looks like in Rome now. This is the outside, which is ridiculously huge. Those black dots on there are people. And then even on the inside is ridiculously huge and ornate, and this tiny little figure right here. There's a person, to put this into scale and perspective, right? The official split of the empire into the two halves that aren't really communicating with each other anymore is going to take place in 395, right? The Western Empire is getting to the point where it's overextended and really has to rely on an ever-increasing number of barbarian tribes to help defend the front, right? Civil wars are going to continue to flare up as people fight over who gets to be the emperor, and that means a lot of dead Romans, high taxation, a great deal of inefficiency, and these people are being essentially, in some cases, chained to their jobs, right? The Germanic barbarians who are being brought in are realizing ever increasingly the inherent weakness of the Western Roman state, and that they have much more in common culturally with many of these other barbarian tribes who are just across, in some cases, the border or the river. And so these rebellions by these barbarians within the empire are going to allow another wave of Germanic invasion to take place. They're going to break through the frontier, these barbarians, and they're going to sack Rome twice. First, in 410, and then again in 455 AD, and then this one is the one that's going to kind of put the nail in the coffin for the Western Roman Empire. They're going to move in and they're going to destroy this Roman monarchy. They're going to depose the last of the Roman emperors, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 AD, and they're going to set up these Germanic kingdoms all throughout the Western Roman Empire. So ironically, Rome comes to this crashing halt here in the 5th century AD. This is the regent for Romulus Augustulus. He's turning over the crown here of the Roman state to these obvious Germanic barbarians. And you got a winged helmet and these leggings. You're a pretty Germanic kind of guy, and that's who these guys are. So Rome is pretty well finished. But the Roman Empire is going to continue on in the east. It is centered on Constantinople, and of course is the Greek half of the empire. Despite the fact that the city of Rome was gone, and that the Roman language of Latin was largely sort of left by the wayside, the eastern half of the Roman Empire still considered themselves Roman. Because now, at this point in history, Rome is not a city, Rome is an idea. Rome is kind of who you are. You're Roman, even though we don't have Rome anymore. It doesn't matter. We're Roman, right? Their main centers of power, though, after the Germanic invasion in the west, is going to be Greece, the Balkans, what is now Turkey, right? Anatolia, especially the old Ionia part of this, Palestine, and Egypt. These are major economic trading centers. Now, they're still relatively secure in that the mountains protect them in the north. You've got the Balkans there. And then also have the deserts here in the south and in the east that are going to keep these people out. One of the mistakes, of course, that the Byzantines make is especially the deserts of Arabia are empty. But they're really not empty. They're full of Arabs. It's just that at this point in history, the Arabs are relatively disunited. So this is what you're going to see here. This is the Eastern Roman Empire that you got in yellow, with the new Germanic kingdoms that begin to take place here in the West. Hard to, the Eastern Roman Empire has a very long history, so it's hard to pick out just kind of one person to be the case study for this. But Justinian is the one that most often comes up. And he becomes the emperor of the East, and he faces an immediate revolt. The East is not immune to the Civil War bug the way that any more than the West was. He manages to crush the revolt, hang on to power, but he understands, much like Claudius and much like a lot of other previous Roman emperors understood, that one of the ways that you can get everybody on your page is to give them a focus to attack somebody else. And he says what we need to do is reconquer the lost parts of the empire. All of the empire is supposed to be Roman. And so this reconquista, right, this reconquest of this is going to absorb a large part of his administration, right? He's going to recapture parts of North Africa, about half of Italy, although it's going to develop into almost a kind of World War I type status in Italy, and also parts of Spain. However, these wars are expensive, and if the two parts of the Roman Empire together didn't have enough manpower to hold the western border, then the eastern half by itself won't either, right? The campaigns deplete the treasury, and of course the bitter war in Italy is going to ravage the countryside and kill a huge number of people. In fact, what you're going to see is all of these conquests are going to prove to be very temporary, in that most of the recaptured areas are going to be lost back to the Germanic invaders because the Byzantines don't have the resources to defend them as well either. I love this little mosaic here of Justinian. You can see him in the middle, and he's surrounded by members of the Christian clergy, the warriors, and then the city administrators, these government bureaucrats. And there he is in the middle, in command of kind of all of it. He represents the church, he represents the state, he represents the army, and so this is him in all of this, right? He wasn't just active in terms of military reconquest of the West. Justinian was also helping to recodify and redo Roman law, and he's going to help produce what eventually will be the medieval bequest that they get from the Roman Empire. He's going to help codify it, and he's also going to help organize it into four main parts. And for those of you who are going to go on after this part of your college career to study law, you'll notice the layout of most Western style of law after this will look really, really similar to the layout of this. One is going to be the body of civil law, which is just you need to know what the law is. We write the law down so that way we know what it is. And these are laws passed by the Senate, the assemblies. There's the digest, which is the decisions of judges. In this case, this is what happened. This is what the judge decided. The idea being that if you have a similar set of circumstances, you should have basically a similar set of outcomes. The idea of precedent, right? Where this already happened before. We already decided this. Let's just think about what is particular to this case. So that way we don't have to retry everything from the ground up. The Institutes, which is essentially like a law textbook, right? It's a summary of main points for training lawyers. How you do law, how you do evidence, how you do procedure for civil law, for criminal law, etc. This is something that we wouldn't have, of course, and that's the novus, right? The novels, or novella, which is the new edicts from the emperor. The emperor could sort of make his own law just by speaking it, right? And so you needed to know what those were as well. Like I said, this is going to become the basis of law for all Europe, where law is going to be followed. So here's some scenes here from the Justinian Code. That's exciting stuff, right? For those of you not in law, roll your eyes and keep going, right? Like I said, one of the mistakes that the Eastern Romans make is that the Arab world is kind of empty, right? And because of the desert nature, it's easy to make that mistake that, well, who all could live out there? Well, it turns out that there are a lot of people here in the Western Arabian Desert that are inhabiting these places. It's just that most of their social energy are kind of turned towards themselves, right? And into this is going to come Muhammad. He's a 7th century camel merchant, and he began to have, according to what he says, visions. He attributed this to Allah, right, which was the chief god of a pantheon of Arabic pagan gods, but now is essentially an interchangeable word for God, right, the one true God in Arabic. According to Muhammad, God's angels showed him the vastness of Allah's creation, right, and commanded him to lead a religious movement, which was going to culminate in submission to Allah's will, or what we would call Islam, through, of course, Muhammad, who is the only true prophet, right? Now, Muhammad then, right, he set out to preach this new faith, which was in part an outgrowth of Judaism and Christianity. You'll often see when they talk about different sort of groupings of religions that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam get grouped together under the Abrahamic, because they all believe that God had a covenant with Abraham. Also, one of the important factors was that the center of this new faith was going to be the Arabic holy city of Mecca. Right? So there's Muhammad. This is him receiving the word from the archangel with this one. So, all right, Muhammad goes to Mecca and he says, hey, this is what we're supposed to be doing. We get this whole new religion that we're supposed to do, and they kick him out. They don't listen. Right? He then goes by to nearby Medina, where they listen to him. Okay, yeah, we want to do this, right? He's then going to form an army of Medina, and they're going to go out and they're going to march on Mecca. So this is a big fight that takes place. Long story short, Muhammad's guys are going to win. They march into Mecca, and they basically say, okay, you guys need to join us. And they're going to convert these people to Islam, right? Muhammad, thus, is going to set the rule for what it is to be a Muslim leader, and that is the combination of both political and spiritual power. To a Muslim, the idea that you could separate church from state, no, you can't. The church and the state have to be the same if you're going to be a fundamentalist Muslim. During this period where you have outward Muslim expansion, Muhammad is going to produce the Quran, right? People are going to, students especially, are going to sit down, they're going to write down the things that he say. This is the Muslim holy book, and in the Quran you have the instructions for a Muslim to live the proper Islamic life. So this is the prophet, right? And this is him. He's the army versus the Meccans. Long story short, the prophet's guys win, right? This is a copy of the Quran. A lot of people make the mistake of equating the Quran to, for example, for Christians, the Bible, because they're both books, they're both writings. But the reality of this is the Quran is essentially a Muslim's Jesus, because a Christian has to have Jesus to get in touch with God, right? Now, this is the conduit, death, resurrection, that kind of thing. Whereas the only connection that a Muslim has is the Quran. You got to read it, you got to understand it, you got to do what it says. The Bible provides useful information for Christians that will help structure their lives, but the actual salvation, the actual ordering of their life comes from Jesus himself. So Islam is literally submission to Allah, right? Islam, right, is peace, peaceful submission. Now, what is in the Quran that these people have to do, right? Set strict guidelines for daily life. You have prayer 5 times a day. You've got to provide alms for the poor, also for the mentally and physically disabled, right? Once in your life, if possible, the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. You also have to observe the holy month of Ramadan, which is usually like in the August, September kind of time frame by our calendar, right? You fast during the day, and then you can eat at night once the sun goes down. Most importantly was faith in Allah and his prophet. Also, there are a few other restrictions, according to the Quran. They're not allowed to eat pork, not allowed to drink alcohol, not allowed to lie, at least not to other Muslims, adulterize, or even choose their own spouse, right? So thus, the prophet and the Quran are the center of Islamic life. So here you can see the Hajj. Man, these guys are around the Kaaba. It's this box that has a meteorite that fell to Earth in ancient times, right? And this is where this is held. It's often referred to as the tier of heaven, right? So what actually happens as a result of this? Muhammad and subsequent Muslim leaders are going to turn these warlike Arabs from being all over each other into outward expanding formidable armies, right? This unification of the Arabs created a big environment for military expansion from a direction that the Byzantine Empire really didn't expect, right? All of a sudden, these guys are pouring out of the Arabian desert, which they thought was a quiet sector, and they're going to take over Palestine, and then they're going to roust these guys out of Egypt. I know it's hard for us to understand that the Middle East at one point was a majority Christian area, but that's true. They then are going to conquer Mesopotamia towards the east, along with Persia, by about 650. Muslim armies are then going to be these fast-moving cavalry units sweeping across North Africa, and by 725, all of North Africa was in their hands, and these guys had moved on by that point into the Iberian Peninsula, and most of Spain had fallen to Muslim forces. They then launched attacks into France, or what you and I would call France today. But Charles Martel, who was Charlemagne's grandfather, defeats these guys at the Battle of Tours, and this is going to help preserve Christianity in Europe as a result of this. And so there you can see this very quick, rapid kind of outward expansion all across the map of Muslim forces, and a big part of the reason for this is the Byzantine Empire, which was occupying a huge chunk of this, were relatively unable to defend against what they thought was a defended border. So here you can see these this dichotomy of different kind of modes of warfare. You have these Arabic Muslim forces in these kind of flowing robes from the desert, and then of course you have these Germanic warriors with this leather armor and these helmets fighting here at the Battle of Tours in France. Well, Muhammad's death is going to cause a significant sort of fork point for Muslim believers, because you have a big rift over leadership. And what you'll see here is eventually the Muslims are going to choose a guy named Abu, who was Muhammad's kind of closest student, right? But he is succeeded by Omar, which is a general. And so the question then is, who is it that's supposed to take over? Is it like a blood descent from Muhammad, people who share his ideology, his connection, that kind of thing? Or is it whoever can be best in charge of the state to protect Muslims and continue to expand Islam in the world? We're going to have a civil war. Many Muslims pushed for Ali, which was Muhammad's son-in-law and thus his legal heir, to be the leader. Many others pushed for Omar to continue to do this, and this is going to be our split into the two major brands of Islam that you can find in the world today. The Shiites, who think that only a descendant of Muhammad can be the legitimate leader, and then the Sunnis, who are a little bit more, well, whoever's in charge, it's a political thing, and because politics and religion go together in Islam, they're okay. The Sunnis, I think, outnumber the Shia in the Middle East and mostly around the world, but the Shia are, they're a pretty important minority, right? All of this takes place here in this period of rapid military expansion, when ever increasingly you see the title of caliph or deputy being used for these people. Now, the caliph was supposed to simply execute Allah's will. They don't need to come up with new law. Everything you need to know if you're Muslim is in the Quran. All you have to do is interpret it and then put it into force, right? But ever increasingly, these caliphs spend much more time on secular rather than on spiritual leadership. So there's a picture. There's Abu Bakr, right? This is him right there. There's the Caliph Omar, and you can see very much so that this is a military guy as a result of this. As I mentioned here, Ali's assassination created a great deal of turmoil, right, in this world. And you'll see that the Umayyad family, or the first dynasty of caliphs, under a guy named Muawiyah, are going to seize power, right? Like I said, you have the Shiites, who believe that only direct descendants of Muhammad should rule, and then the Sunnis are going to follow from this as well. So what do the Umayyads do once they've got political power, right? They're going to continue to concentrate that political power into what you and I would recognize as essentially an emperorship, right? They will continue to lead this Muslim expansion towards Europe from the south, but are going to heavily tax these non-Arab Muslims, right? What's going to happen, though, over the course of time is you're going to have a lot of people that are going to find it a lot easier. Look, the Muslims are the new guys, the new power that's sort of ruling things. I'm just going to convert over and I'm going to be a Muslim. And then ever increasingly, well, no. You guys aren't equal to the Arab Muslims that took over, and so they're going to be treated as second-class citizens. Well, eventually, the second-class citizen status is going to get to be so big for so many people that they're going to revolt against these the powers that rule over them. And the Umayyads are forced to try and put down a rebellion. Long story short, the Umayyads lose, right? The Abbasids are going to come in, they sweep the Umayyads from power, and the Abbasids are going to set up a new caliphate. One of the things they want to do is make sure that all Muslims everywhere are treated equally, and so they're going to level the taxation here, and they're also going to move the capital to Baghdad. So a much more political shift in this regard. But these guys were also interested in concentrating on urban development, and they wanted to make sure that there was cultural expansion. And this is what the period that often referred to as the Muslim kind of golden age takes place. You got a large land area, and so the same problem that Alexander's empires had, that the Mongol empires are going to have, that the Roman Empire had, which is how do you manage all of these different places that are so far away? The Abbasid Empire began splintering up as you get here into the 800s AD. So while politically, they were supposed to be, well, you're not supposed to break away because, Allah ruled all of us through the leader, through the caliph, but ever increasingly, they were pretty much politically independent of what they were doing with each other. But this shared religion still unites a lot of these regions today. So this is an Umayyad palace, and again, this is medieval art, so don't think that either it was really, really tiny or the guys were really, really huge. But it gets the sense of how wealthy and powerful these guys are. But you can also see the splintering that began to take place here under the Abbasids as a result of that. When we talk about the great cultural achievements, though, here of the Muslim societies, as we have this consolidation here, the only people who are any kind of serious resistance in this zone is going to come from the Byzantine Empire, right? And this is going to allow, since you're no longer concentrating as much on outward expansion, resources and social interests are going to turn inward. We see the urbanization, we see the trade routes continue to pick up, and we're also going to see that Muslim scholarship is going to enter a golden age as well. These Muslim scholars were really, really interested here in what had been going on in the world for the past several years, and they're going to reach kind of their apogee. They're going to absorb a great deal of ancient thought, including a lot of classical texts from Rome and Greece, and it's good for us that they did, because they're going to be the ones, in some cases, that will be the only way to preserve some of this stuff from the really ancient period that we had for a long, long time. As I mentioned, they were big creators of urban societies with sprawling urban cities. And the mathematicians, the cartographers, astronomers, the chemists, these doctors, they all make important and significant contributions here in world civilization in their various fields, right? These are going to be contributions that are later going to benefit a lot of these European societies who are going to have to sort of crawl themselves out from under the rubble that they had ironically kind of pulled down on top of themselves with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So here you can see these guys are hard at work at one of these Muslim institutions. They're doing map making, and they're doing some chemistry work, and they're doing some, I don't know, gravity, whatever it is that they're working on. They got, I don't know, perpetual motion machine, compass, I don't know, something really cool that they've got going on here. And this, of course, is going to benefit a lot of these inventions, and ideas are going to benefit later Europeans during the age of exploration, the age of Renaissance, et cetera, et cetera. Here you can see a cattle caravan approaching one of these big Muslim cities at this point. Here you can see Muslim architecture being exported as far away as the Taj Mahal in India, and the sprawling skyline of many of these Muslim cities here in the Middle East. You'll also see the development here of the Arabic writing numeral system, which is much easier to use than trying to do math with Roman numerals, the invention of zero throughout this period, and the mathematical concepts that go along with this. So these guys make a number of important contributions to world civilization, as we'll see going forward later on. And that's it for these guys.